Today I'm going to talk to you about making your own binding to use as a finish on a raw edge of a garment, so on a neckline or an armhole or anywhere where you want to apply some binding. With a woven fabric, if you cut it on the bias, so that's on the 45-degree angle across the grain of the fabric, you'll find that you'll be able to go around curves and it will work really effectively that way. If you're just binding a straight edge, well, you don't necessarily need to cut it on the bias. You could probably just cut it on the straight and bind it that way. But we're going to be doing it specifically for binding the raw edge of a neckline or an armhole, that kind of application. So the first thing I've done is I've got a piece of calico fabric. I've lined up the selvage so that it's lined up on the cutting board with one of the straight lines. So that's sitting on the board flat and straight. And then I'm getting my metal ruler and I'm lining it up with the 45-degree angle line that's on the mat, which makes it really easy to line up. Now you can put a weight on that if you want, otherwise you just need to hold the ruler firmly, get your rotary cutter and just cut along the edge of the ruler. So just put some weight down on the ruler so it doesn't move while you're cutting. Now, using a rotary cutter in this way enables you to get a really nice, sharp, straight line. If you can use scissors, it depends how good your cutting skills are. And having a sharp blade on your rotary cutter makes it easier too. The next thing you need to do is just measure across the width of the binding. So usually 3 centimetres is a good width. We actually have a straight sewer machine set up in room 102 that has a binding attachment on it, and you can feed through 3 centimetre flat binding and apply that quite quickly using the machine all in one step. Or you can, of course, sew this on to the edge and then wrap it around the edge of the garment and do it that way too. So I've measured across 3 centimetres at both ends, and now I'm just going to cut that again. Okay, and there I've got a piece of bias binding ready to apply onto a garment. Now you could continue cutting strips across. I might just cut one more and then show you how you would join that. It can waste a bit of fabric, so the idea is to make good use of the fabric. Perhaps cut up as much bias as you can so you're not wasting it. Okay, and then to join that, I would just go over to the machine and just square off those ends. And I could go over to the machine and just sew from one end over to here, stitch that so that I've got a join in it, so that I end up with a continuous piece of binding like that. And then you would just trim back that seam there like that.
Yeah, that's a really good method to use, I think.
Yeah, it is a good method, and you can join as much together as you like for whatever task you have to do. Of course you could, if you knew what your neck measurement and your armhole measurements were, you could just cut a piece that's long enough to do each of those.
But don't be afraid to actually have seams in the binding. Like if you're binding quite a long way, you don't have to have a piece of binding that's 1.5 meters long with no joins in it. You can cut smaller pieces, and provided that you do a nice job of the join, it's not really a problem for having joins in the bias.
Yeah. Okay, now we're going to talk about how to cut your own binding to use with stretch or knit fabric. So knit fabric's a little bit different, and it will depend on whether you have a knit fabric that has a two-way stretch like polyester lycra or swimwear type of stretch fabric. Usually has a stretch going both ways across and down the fabric. If you have fabric like that, you can just cut down the length of the fabric, because we want the binding to stretch, so we want to go with the direction of the stretch. So if you've got two-way fabric, you can cut down the length or you can cut across. If you have one-way stretch fabric like this one here, it only stretches across. So here's our edge of our fabric here, which has a bit of glue in it, just to keep it flat. So it only stretches across. There's very little or there's no stretch down the warp of the fabric at all. So the stretch is across. Now what happens when the fabric stretches, which it will do as the binding feeds through the binding attachment of the cover stitch binder machine, it will stretch and pull on it a little bit, and what happens is the fabric starts to roll up on the edge, like you can see here. So as soon as you stretch that, you get this rolling happening, and this actually helps you to determine which is the right and wrong side of the fabric. Usually the right side of the fabric is the side that has the little V's of the knit, and it's usually that edge that folds, that the roll folds in towards, so that's considered the right side of the fabric. So that when that rolls, when it's got a bit of pressure on it in the binding attachment, it tends to make it not always sew on correctly. So this causes a problem. So what we do, instead of cutting across the width of the fabric where the stretch is, we want to just cut off grain a bit. So we don't want to cut it straight across, and we don't want to cut it on a 45-degree angle either. We want to just place the ruler so that rather than it being straight across, it's just off grain. And really, I don't usually measure this, like it's not 30 degrees or anything, it's just a random measurement like that. And then I just cut it across. Like that. Now the binding attachment that we have on our cover stitch binder machine is for 3 centimetre flat binding. So we want to measure 3 centimetres again. Three centimetres, and then we're just going to cut across there. Okay, so we've still got the stretch in it, but we're not going to get that roll happening on the edge to the same extent as what was happening when it was straight across the fabric. So that's going to work in the binding attachment much better than if we'd cut it across the width of the fabric. So when you're putting the fabric into the binding attachment, you will put it in so that it faces with the wrong side facing towards you, and then as it goes through and pulls in under the foot, it will fold it up, and it will turn the edges under, and it will sew it on really, really beautifully for you. Now with this method, you need to know what measurements you need. So you need to know what your armhole measurement is, or your neck measurement, or your wrist measurement if you're binding the edge of a sleeve. You need to know what that is, and you need to have a piece that is long enough for that, plus about another 10 centimetres, say, just to use to get it started at the beginning, and so that you can also run off at the end to cut it off. So you can't put joins in this. The binding attachment will not be happy if you have joins in it. So if you're cutting your own, make sure that you cut enough pieces for each application that you're doing.